So the subject of today's session is called How Can Writers Survive in a Podcasting Universe? Writers v Podcasters. And I think we decided that we'd choose quite a provocative title as a kind of way of exploring a lot of interrelated issues. And I've got a fantastic panel of 4 people here to help us explore some of these issues. First of all, I've got Afsaneh Gray, who is under commission from Audible and is also a member of the Film Trust Elevate Writers Room. And her play, Give a Man a Bible, was longlisted for the Women's Prize for Playwriting and shortlisted for Theatre Uncut Political Playwriting Prize. So welcome, Afsaneh. She is our young buck. And then next to her, on her left, I've got my seasoned pro, which is Martin Jameson. And he has over 100 radio drama credits, and including a standout best adaptation gong for the 2017 for the Emile Zola season. And his most recent work is 5 topical satires called Angst. And then he's my seasoned pro. And then I have my Mr. Producer, which is David Barnes. And he's a writer and a script consultant, probably best well known for Wooden Overcoats. And the latest series is in pre-production. And his consultancy includes productions for Audible and BBC Sounds. And finally, I have my platform princess, which is Shannon Martin, who is for the last 15 years has been the marketing and communications director for Podbean, one of the major podcasting sites since 2006, and the site on which I have my own podcast, Rainbow Dads. So full disclosure there, I'm a big fan. So what I thought might be interesting to start with is to start from the point of view of your good selves wanting to approach this whole new world. I've described it as the Wild West or punk rock. I don't know if you remember a magazine called Sniffing Glue. I don't know if anybody here is old enough to remember it, but basically the encouragement of Sniffing Glue was buy a guitar, learn 3 chords and start a punk band. So there's something of that kind of pioneer spirit in the podcasting world, as well as a lot of unregulated stuff, which I'm sure we will come on to. But I thought I'd start with people's experiences thus far of working in this non-broadcast world. And I wanted to start with our young buck, with Afsaneh, just to ask her, how has it been for you so far? How were you introduced to this world? And what's your expectation of it?
I got involved with the Audible Emerging Playwrights Fund, which is, I think they have submissions annually or biannually. You can just Google it, and basically it's through the American branch of Audible. So there's US Audible and UK Audible, the American branch, and basically you just send them a play and a little paragraph about why you want to write for audio. And I sent them my first play, Octopus, like maybe 3 years ago, with a little paragraph. I didn't hear anything for a year, completely forgot about it, and suddenly I get an email out of the blue saying, hey, we'd love to have a chat with you. And that was about a year ago, and so I had a chat with them, and then they were just like, yeah, we'd love you to write something for us. And so with that, you're writing a 90-minute drama about anything you want. I didn't have to pitch any ideas, so it's literally blank slate, which is incredibly exciting. It took a really long time to get the contract done, because my agent was just like, oh, what is this? This is like a very different kind of contract. So that was interesting. So that took like a full year from when I was basically offered to when I finally signed the contract, which was just in January. And so I'm just at the beginning of it, really. So I'm just kind of writing my first draft now, basically.
So it was investment in your talent,
yeah,
in a sense, rather than a particular idea.
Yeah. So that's very cool. Like it's a real privilege, obviously, just to be able to write whatever. And then the other stuff I've done is I've done a bit of sort of story editing for my partner, who's a journalist, who's done some podcasts. I'm about to work on his new podcast, and I'm just about to hopefully do something similar for Wondery, to do a bit of script editing and story editing for them. So that's kind of where I'm at with it.
So with your partner on his work, is that a fiction as well, or is that a completely different
No, it's factual. Well, he does
Factual.
kind of so he did a podcast called the Puppet Master on Radio 4, which was it's factual, but you know, like, we borrowed quite a lot from the way that the Americans just really have such tight dramaturgy on their podcasts, and so we really wanted to make sure that we were telling a story, and that was kind of what my role was, really just to make sure it was structured in a compelling way.
That's a really good point about the kind of emphasis on narrative and structure, and, as you said, tight dramatic structure. Martin, my sense of, because we've known each other for a while, is that you're you know, as I said, you're somebody who haunts the corridors of the BBC. Have you worked in non-broadcast world yet?
Well, no, I haven't. But my interest in it is really in the, you know, all my work has been with the BBC or with independents for the BBC. But I suppose my interest, and the interest that you and I have been talking about on the audio committee of the Guild, is really about the disconnect that the apparent disconnect. I'll be careful with my words, between what was the home of audio drama, which was, you know, BBC network drama, and this sort of massive, enormous landscape that of opportunity that's opening up, and I suppose the area of concern that I have is that there seems to be, I mean, it might be going on in the background, but there seems to be something of I've been wanting to say the word failure and being very careful. There seems to be a bit of a block when it comes to the BBC, who have championed this art form, sort of really engaging with where it's going, because the BBC have an opportunity to sort of lead, if you like, and they're not. In fact, actually, we know that the amount of drama that the Radio 4 has commissioned over the last few years has decreased by over 100 hours annually, and it's and this creates a sort of tricky situation where a lot of the standards and contracts and things that protect writers, you know, on the network platforms like Radio 4 and Radio 3 become less important. So the effect of it being a bit of a Wild West is sort of exacerbated. Does that make sense? Yeah. Do you see what I mean? Yeah. So that's really kind of my angle on it, I suppose.
Great. David, is it a Wild West from your point of view?
I suppose, yeah, in a sense, it's a Wild West which now has lots of very big companies in it, perhaps making it slightly less wild than it was before. And I suppose my background is, I started as a playwright. I mainly did theatre and found it very difficult to get plays on, and particularly the budgets to get plays on, because it's very, very difficult. But suddenly I'd written an audio comedy in student radio back in my university days. It was remade with some directors and actors I'd known from university. And then I was working with those actors and living with one of them. And we said, well, look, it's very difficult to get a play on. And we were struggling to get our ideas sort of picked up and produced by the sort of more traditional broadcasting companies, and finding that, you know, we really wanted to be making lots of new programs and shows. And they said, well, look, what about a podcast? They're becoming very popular in America, and lots of audiences, you know, are listening to stuff. And we created a series called Wooden Overcoats, which is a sitcom about rival funeral directors who live on a Channel island. And as the series has gone on, we've had 3 seasons. There's a 4th season, which should have come out a year ago, but COVID delayed it. So we're pushing it, should be hopefully recording later this year. And suddenly, by creating a show and releasing it via the infrastructure of podcasts and things like sort of iTunes and everything else, we suddenly found ourselves connecting with audiences we hadn't thought possible before, and globally. And it was wonderful. Suddenly, you know, you can see how many people are downloading your show, and people would start talking about it on social media and Twitter and Facebook and Tumblr and everywhere else. And it was just a wonderful sensation. And from then on, I started to do more audio work. it's mainly for independent, certainly as a writer, mainly for independent companies or companies like Big Finish Productions and their Doctor Who releases. And then I managed to get a job in Audible, working mainly in Audible around Australia, actually, Australia and more recently Singapore, working as a script editor, very much helping writers, mainly screenwriters, adapt to audio, particularly with things like narrative structure, making sure that visuals are now more oral, but still visual in a sense, and doing a great deal of work there. So all of my work, I basically pivoted straight from stage into almost exclusively audio at the moment.
So picking up Afsaneh's point about, I was really interested in what she said about the tight dramatic structure.
Yes, yeah.
Is that something that is you think is particular to or audio drama now? Is that something that you felt that it has become more of a priority?
I'd say it depends very much on the type of show. Whilst there are a lot of very tightly structured shows, particularly if it's a thriller or a company like Audible, which does a lot of crime shows or true crime shows, horror and science fiction, there are a lot of forms which have a great deal of structure. And I do a lot of that in my own work, especially sitcoms, which need a great deal of structure to make work. But podcasts, as I say, they're a medium rather than a genre. They have a lot of different types. And there are innumerable podcast dramas, many of which are very loosely structured, very loosely plotted, but are instead more about delving into the mindsets of particular characters or particular dynamics. There are a lot of much more sort of relationship-centered podcasts as opposed to traditional sort of thumping along narrative adventure type stuff or sitcom. So I think there are a lot of different types out there, and it really is an area where a lot of different styles of storytelling are happening, which is why it's a very, very exciting medium, especially right now, as one which has a greater intake of new talent, perhaps, than other forms of traditional media like television and film and so on.
I think that's undoubtedly true. That's a great segue into Shannon, because obviously you sit on the other side of this, and I was particularly interested in what David said about connecting with an audience that he didn't necessarily expect to connect with, or it wasn't a typical audience. And I wonder if it's been what's your experience been at Podbean with cultivating audiences, particularly for dramas, I guess, because that's where our focus of interest is at the moment.
Yeah, I think it's very different than a lot of other things, because it is much more that Wild West, that kind of ground up, that word of mouth kind of situation. And I think a lot of people are surprised. I hear from podcasters all the time, they're surprised by the global nature of their audience. They'll actually question us as a platform when they see the geographies of their downloads, and they'll say, but why do I have someone downloading my podcast in Japan? And I'll say, the internet. This is how it works, and there's people, and sometimes I think they think that because it's in English and it's a country that's not the native language. And I explain, lots of people speak English all over the world. And so it's very interesting because there's so much potential, but it's also really challenging because there's not a typical straight to audience marketing path, that would be done in traditional formats.
Is that because it's just too young a medium to work out what really works in terms of connecting with an audience? Or is it, what would you ascribe that to?
Well, a little bit, but I think it's also because there's such a wide variety of podcasts and ways that podcasts are being done. So when you have a large company doing a podcast that has kind of maybe a traditional way of marketing, they might do a lot of the same things. But then you have a lot of people who literally, some people who build a show through a social media reach that they had before. Some people, for audio drama in particular, audio drama and true crime, there is a tremendous amount of sort of this vibrant word of mouth sort of network among listeners. They're really super fans. A lot of times if someone listens to a number of audio dramas, they're constantly looking for more. And they know each other's shows and they give each other recommendations, and that's definitely true for true crime as well. So
the fandom element is a really important part about this whole area, isn't it?
Definitely, yeah. So I think it's just so different because there's so many types of podcasts, so many ways that people go about it and get into it, and so I think we do know some things that work, but I see different things working for different types of shows very much, and different types of, there's independent, there's me and you, Nicholas, and we start a podcast, and we have to figure out our way to grow an audience versus Audible or BBC or any company that comes with sort of a team to do certain marketing tasks. So it's going to vary a lot what would work for those different situations.
So, I mean, one of the questions I'm sure a lot of people here will be wanting to know, if they have an idea for a podcast drama, where would they go to try and find a producer? David?
I would say, well, for a start, there are companies like Audible, for instance, which have clearly programs where you can sort of submit ideas, or they find new talent. But if I'll go from, say, more maybe the independent area, which I started from, which was very much you just create the podcast yourself and see if anyone likes it. I think, like, for me, it was very much a combination of people who I'd already worked with in a different medium, in that case stage, who also knew people. And when we started, it was mainly me as a writer, and we had some actors, and then we brought 2 producers on board who I think had only recently graduated in radio from, I think, Goldsmiths, and I think it was one of their earliest sort of projects outside, and we created it that way, and it was quite organic, and we picked up new actors and talent along the way. But I think in terms of finding new ideas, if you're, say, I'd say there are probably 2 different routes you can take. There's either the one which is you look to the people who are around you, you're working with already, perhaps in a different medium, and you try to pull something together. And you may not all have the exact knowledge to create the podcast, but you might pick it up along the way, or you'll find people who do. Also, if there's any writers watching this who don't have necessarily a team they can sort of jump into and say, hi, let's make a new thing on audio, but you're just a writer yourself with an idea, there are numerous places you can go to already. Like most mediums, you can go to Twitter, find the Twitter handles of podcasts you already like, and follow the creators of those podcasts, who will undoubtedly also be following and speaking to on Twitter other podcasters, and you end up sort of understanding the conversations happening. Somewhere like Facebook has the Audio Drama Hub, which has about 4,500 members. There's the Podcaster Support Group, which I looked today has about 31,000 members, where people of seasoned pros and totally new people come together and swap ideas, or somebody says, oh, I've got an idea for a show, I need somebody to help, or actors or producers, and they're going, oh, I want to do a project, send me your idea. There are also various places have newsletters. There are newsletters and emails. I'm subscribed, I know, to Pod News, which sends me news every day. There's one called Audio Dramatic, which has more sort of personally curated news and reviews and opportunities specifically for scripted audio writers, whether it's comedy or drama, whatever. I think there's one called Discover Pods, Bellow Collective. There are quite a few out there which will send you either regularly or irregularly reviews, articles and opportunities, much like there exist for theatre and television and film. And the last one I'd say, I don't want to bitter on too long on this, but also less available now, but live events, when they can start up again. Things like the London Podcast Festival, that was at King's Place in London. There's the British Podcast Awards. Numerous podcasts do live shows as well. All of these are opportunities to go along, see shows you like, but also chat in the bar afterwards. And you end up meeting other people who are of a similar interest, who might be looking for a show to do, or want to sort of collaborate. It's much the same, I think, as, say, theatre in that way. There's a lot more technology involved, but the ways you make connections, the ways you meet exciting collaborators are very similar. You just need to find those places, but there are a lot of opportunities to do that.
Great. Afsaneh, did you think about going to the BBC with your idea? Or did you plug into some of the networks that David's been talking about?
I haven't, and it was fascinating to hear about it. The idea I had actually was a sort of short story that I didn't know exactly what to do with it, and so I kind of knew I wanted to make it, but I hadn't really fixed on a medium. And then when I had this opportunity, I just thought, great, this is actually going to work really well for audio, partly because it's actually very visual, and actually I think there's something that audio could do really well about the sort of
painting better pictures in the mind.
Yeah, exactly. So it sort of worked really well. The only thing I'd maybe add to what David said was, if you've got an agent, you can because my agent has sort of, we've spoken a bit about whether I want to try and do some audio drama, and they can help you, they can facilitate that connection with a producer. I think if you want to do that.
Yeah. Martin, you've recently been involved in an initiative. Well, tell us a little bit about Limelight, which is the BBC's response to this, because of course that is always the other part of the elephant in the room, isn't it? The BBC's response to what else is happening in the non-broadcast world.
Yes, well, Limelight is a strange beast, because in the course of cutting their output and their drama commissioning, as I'm sure many of you will know, that there has been a 45-minute slot every weekday afternoon, and part of the cuts to radio drama is to reduce one of those slots every week just to 30 minutes. That's a cut, which is a negative for writers. However, something very, very interesting has happened literally just in the last couple of days, which is that they've decided to market this new 30-minute slot, which represents in real terms a 15-minute cut for all of us, as a new brand called Limelight. Excuse me, that's my daughter in my computer. I'm like one of those scientists. My daughter was my computer forever telling me I've got an email. I've turned it. Oh, hello.
Oh, now we've lost him completely.
Now you've lost me.
Okay, because we can still hear you.
I don't know what's happened to my video. I've gone red. I don't know why that is.
Somebody's been listening to you talk about Limelight. They don't like it.
Yes, well, so
you carry on.
I'll just carry on. So Limelight is now a brand, and the BBC have seemingly finally woken up to how to begin to sort of fuse their network tradition of radio drama with the world of podcasting. So before, what was happening was that basically you had stuff that was going out on Radio 4, Radio 3 that would go on to Sounds, and you wouldn't know where you could find it. And you wouldn't know where you could find it. It was often hidden very low unless you prioritized it in some way. And a lot of people didn't even know the drama was on Sounds. And then BBC Sounds were commissioning some non-network material, and that also was, they were marketing in a very sporadic kind of way. So now they've decided to create a slot that has a brand, which is for this, a lot more like what David was describing, of this kind of tightly structured narrative drama. That'll be in 30-minute episodes, and they're going to market it as a brand. You can hear it on the network if you want, but it will be, I think, pushed much further forward on the Sounds platform as this new drama brand, drama podcast brand, Limelight. And even though it does represent this cut, actually, I think this is a really positive thing, because it's like several years too late. They have woken up to look at least looking at how the corporation, which is this sort of behemoth that hasn't really been perhaps leading in the way that it could, can act within the sort of podcast market. And I'm an eternal optimist that I am. I hope that will actually be a good thing, because there is a huge audience there who will come to it. They will also come to some of the more independent stuff, the more niche stuff, and you should get a bit more interchange between those two audiences, if indeed they are distinct.
Good, thank you. Let's move on to the thorny but eternal issue of rates and payments, and let's just explore that a bit, because obviously this is something that, as the Writers Guild, we're very it's something that we continually fighting the BBC in terms of not just rates but terms and conditions. How does that, what kind of you don't have to go into huge detail, David, but how does it compare writing for one of your shows to doing a BBC show?
I think it really depends on where money comes from. I'm sure something we'll discuss even further in this panel is what are the ways to monetize. Monetize,
absolutely.
That's going to come up, and there'll be numerous things that come out, whether it's sponsorship, Patreon, fundraisers, or networks, and so on. I think there are broadly speaking, I suppose in podcasts, especially in the independent area, you have two types in terms of how often they happen around the year. You've got those podcasts which are basically on all year round, maybe a weekly sort of show. They don't tend to be scripted podcasts because of the amount of work that would take, but those sort of shows are more likely able to have regular income coming in on something like Patreon, where you can say, give us a certain amount of money a month and we will be creating the show, and they expand the show as a result. Something like, say, Wood and Overcoats and many of the other shows I've worked on are more shorter. They're limited series. Wood and Overcoats tends to be 8 to 10 episodes per season. Each episode is between 30 minutes to 45 minutes normally. And we fundraise, all of our seasons have been fundraised by a sort of Kickstarter or Indiegogo. We've been able to increase the amount each time. In terms of the rates compared to the BBC, I'm sure we're somewhat less than the BBC. You have rather more resources to pull on. We use what resources, all the money that we have for the show, and some of it comes in from merchandising or special episodes that people can pay whatever they want online. All of it goes straight back into the making of the show. But it is, I suppose, at the very beginning, we did pitch it around two places at the BBC and two others, and television companies in the UK, which were going into audio, or had audio, and we just found it very, very difficult to get these things made. Whilst I'm sure, if one of them turned around and said, right, here's your big budget, off you go, we probably have said yes. I'm not necessarily sure in this particular show we've gone independent as the first choice. By going independent, there are still a lot of positives to doing that. Money is always a problem, but if you can find a way of balancing the books and getting enough income to make the show you want to make, the independence you have as a creator and as a creative team is very alluring. Beyond that, I don't think I'll give any specific figures. I don't think I can sort of compare us to the BBC or to other larger companies, but I'm sure somebody else.
Can I just push you a little bit on you took it to the BBC and you weren't, was that a timing thing? Was that literally you were twiddling your thumbs for too long and you wanted to get on with it?
It's more, sometimes it's timing. I was aware with a few things that I'd pitched or with friends of mine who had things on at the BBC that the time between the initial pitch and it being released on radio was quite long. As a comparison, Wood and Overcoats season 1, we came up with the broad idea in around about sort of November, December 2014. And in September 2015, we released the first of 8 half-hour episodes. And in that time, we had written, cast, recorded, produced, and were then releasing. And the entire show was released, between sort of pitch, coming up with the idea and then releasing the whole show and starting a series of live performances. It took less than a year, which was seen by some I knew in some of these companies as quite a fast turnaround. And we've managed to maintain that sort of level, except for the most recent season, which was hobbled by COVID-19. Yeah. So we were able to go to our own, we were able to set our own deadlines, our own timeline and work to that, which gave us a great deal of freedom and flexibility, which, as I say, it was, whilst I'm sure if we had partnered with a larger corporation early on, we may have had larger budgets and there would have been many, many benefits. There were a great deal of positives, and one of them was we could make a show exactly how we wanted, very, very quickly, thanks entirely due to the talent involved. And the show had about sort of 20, 30, 40 people working on that first season. I think even more between producers, actors, writers. I had a team of writers working on it. And it was it was entirely exhilarating. It was one of the most exciting things I'd ever done. And we all came away from it thinking, I didn't know that could happen, that we could do that. We thought it was just, you come up with an idea, pitch it to the BBC, yes or no, and that was it. We didn't. We decided to do it our own way. And then we had an 8-episode show, and from then on led to many other things.
Fantastic. Shannon, monetizing. David mentioned monetizing. What other opportunities are there to make money from your
Well, I wanted to share an interesting fact, which is, we know, we're talking about the growth of podcasting. In next year, the advertising revenue in podcasts is expected to hit $1 billion and $2 billion by 2023. So
it'll go up exponentially between 1 to 2 billion in 2 years.
Yeah. So this year it was 842 million. next year,
Wow.
in 2021, it's expected this year, which is this year, it's expected to be 1 billion.
I know the years blur, don't they, in COVID?
and then 2 billion by 2023.
Wow.
So there's a lot of advertising money out there. I would say there's a lot of different ways people go about getting ads and sponsors, and that is certainly one method of monetizing. And David mentioned fundraising, whether it be sort of a one-time, Kickstarter, those types of things. And we see a lot of people doing that, especially, as he mentioned, with a limited series or a special project, or someone coming off of another special project where there's a good fan base. It really makes sense for. And then the sort of donations ongoing model, which is, we have something called Podbean Patron, there's Patreon, there's now a million things, there's Buy Me a Coffee, there's all these kinds of listener support models. I really like that for a lot of shows, and I think it can really work well. There's a number of shows I know that support themselves fully on that, themselves and solely by that kind of donations kind of model. And then depending on the types of podcasts, there's all kinds of things that are sort of ancillary monetizing things, merchandising, doing live shows. There's a true crime show that I still follow, I guess, on social media, and I didn't attend, but they had a live show recently like this, and they had a huge audience. It was tremendous. So I don't know, I can't remember what the ticket price was, but especially when you think of the production cost behind putting on a online webinar type style, and then all the ticket money that they were bringing in, because they weren't renting a venue or anything. It's certainly pretty good, and I imagine that's going to have a lot of a resurgence.
What's so fascinating? That's an interesting question. Who benefits from the advertising revenue? I'm just jumping in here with that question.
Yeah, and I think, in a lot of cases, there are a lot of podcasters benefiting, because a lot of people are doing direct kind of deals. It is the Wild West, but certainly a lot of bigger companies are more and more are eating up that, that piece of it. At Podbean, we're mainly a hosting platform, but we provide a lot of tools. And obviously we have a couple things. We have a platform where people can use our technology to run their own ads, in which case we have sort of a flat rate, but we don't take a cut. So it's actually very attractive for podcasters. But when we bring the ads to them, we take a cut. So of course, as that grows, we do benefit as well. And the podcasters benefit, but there's a lot of services like that. There's a lot of companies that are solely advertising, podcast advertising companies, and doing quite well.
What's so interesting about all of this is it's turning us all into mini producers. I mean, as writers, we may want to preserve our role as a writer, but once you enter this world, you are inevitably going to become a producer. And that, of course, can offer lots of challenges, but also lots of exciting possibilities as well. Afsaneh, I want to come to you and ask you about, when I write for the BBC, I'm very aware that I'm allowed a certain number. The budgetary requirements require a certain number of actors, etc., a certain amount of time to produce the finished piece. Have you been given any restrictions in terms of what you can do with your 90-minute drama for Audible?
So initially they said I think it had to be a cast of maximum 3. But then when I spoke to them, they were like, well, actually, that's very flexible. The one thing that I have not been allowed to do is turn it into a musical.
How very dare they?
I know. But yeah, other than that, it's so far anyway, it's been sort of remarkably kind of free and easy. And I think basically they're kind of like, look, if you give us a good justification for it, then we're up for it. That's the vibe. And also in terms of content, so I think, obviously when you're writing for the BBC, you have to think a lot about language and content, what you can and cannot say, etc. Like, my story is very explicit and, quite out there, and all of that is all fine.
That's fascinating, because when it wasn't a drama. When I did Rainbow Dads, which is about stories of gay and bisexual dads, one of the great liberating aspects of this was not having to worry about producer guidelines. So that actually, when we talked about some quite adult things, the invitation there was to really talk about them. And I thought that was, for me, as I said, having worked within the BBC, that felt like a real privilege and a real advantage. Ken Bentley's asked a question here. What does Shannon think of Apple introducing podcast subscriptions?
Well, I definitely think that there needs to be more of that kind of thing, but let's see how it all pans out with Apple. They're definitely still the big player. Spotify in a lot of cases is getting to be as big, if not bigger in some places. Particularly when you look at globally, because Apple products versus Android products have a very different usage, different parts of the world. So I think Apple getting into doing this kind of thing, a lot of us as platforms have had subscription type of things that we've offered people for a long time. And a lot of people have done them through their own websites and that kind of stuff. But obviously the player that most people use is going to be really important in that. So I think it's a good move. When that came out, there were other Apple things released, and it has, to be honest, been a giant mess, a nightmare. If you're a podcaster, you may have experienced some of this where the system was down and new podcasts weren't being accepted, and just a lot of stuff that it wasn't a very smooth release. So we'll see how it pans out. There's a lot of confusion because Apple used to use the word subscribe for subscribing to a free podcast. They came out a little while ago saying, oh, we're going to probably change that to follow. And then they launched paid subscriptions. But if you ask around, sometimes it's hard enough to get people to understand what a podcast is. And not as much anymore as it used to be. But I think the listeners is still maybe a little befuddled about subscription, subscribe, follow, and all of that.
And what's Podbean's view on rights? Because indies, traditionally ask a lot and like to keep hold of the rights. What's the Podbean? And then I'm going to ask David the same question.
Oh, what was the question?
What's your relationship with the rights of the material that you?
Yeah, it's 100% the podcasters. We have a terms of service that gives a right to there are certain rights they have to give that allow us to distribute it. And those kind of things. But the ownership of content is 100% in the hands of the podcaster. And similarly, most podcast platforms, maybe not 100%, but if you host somewhere, you do want to make sure that what are their terms in terms of what they can and can't do in terms of, for example, putting ads in your podcast. Most don't do that, but that you could be using a free platform where that's part of what you're agreeing to, or some other, things like that. So just always check with platforms, but it hasn't been sort of common in the hosting world in the past. And now you're just getting into all different kinds of stuff with people doing exclusive shows and things that weren't also existing much in the past. So it's just really changing in terms of what, people used to host with a platform like Podbean, and that meant they owned it and we helped distribute it everywhere. It's on Spotify, it's on Apple Podcasts, it's on the Podbean app. It's out there everywhere. But of course, there's a lot of people doing exclusive Spotify shows now. Not a lot.
I'd like to come back to that in a moment. I think that's obviously an interesting indication of where we might be going. But I want to ask David about rights. What rights do you demand from your writers?
For the rights in an individual, and say for some of Wooden Overcoats, our company just makes that one show rather than it being a production company that produces other things. It's just the one show. Similar to other shows that I've written for, and I've written as a guest contributing writer to numerous other people's series, independent series, and it's usually essentially the rights in the individual episode go into the company so that they are able to release the episode at all. But quite often there'll be, I think, where rights become very interesting, especially things like IP, is when it comes to, say, television production companies suddenly lean in and say, oh, we'd like to adapt that, or we'd like your IP for this. And we understand now it's particularly popular, or rather it seems to be a growing thing in America especially. We always get news stories saying Hollywood are suddenly really interested in podcasts and they want to pick up a show and turn it into this. And sometimes they have. We do know podcasts that have been turned into successful television programs or streaming programs. It can be quite tricky, especially when you get, I've fielded numerous meetings from either agencies or production companies, etc. in America who said, could we have the rights in your show? And then we have the exclusive right to pitch it around, etc. And I think you do have to be very careful because it's very easy to get starry-eyed of, oh, a television company wants to make X. But, sometimes I feel they can rely on the idea that the podcasters don't know much about this situation and therefore are likely to sign all their rights away or be very silly with them. You have to be sometimes somewhat guarded because it is ultimately your show, your ideas. with Wooden Overcoats, we have there's the team of us. We the initial ideas, most of which are most of the characters or the settings are mine, but it's more like a playground. Other writers can come in, create whatever stories, and we talk about them in a writing team. The rights and the individual scripts will go into the company, just as the scripts either in for other companies will go into theirs, because it's ultimately creating stories within a shared universe of IP. It's an interesting one where I think writers creating shows at the moment are becoming wiser and wiser to the fact that IP and ideas are very important and important to safeguard, especially if you want to take them into other mediums. I'm not saying that podcasts exist to trial run shows for television and film, though some can. It is a great medium in its own right to create its own shows. But yes, if a TV company comes knocking on the door, make sure you know what you're doing or have a representative work for you, because it is a Wild West world out there, and the guidelines of what can and can't be done are still quite blurred.
That's a brilliant, and I've just been reminded by Kate that the Writers Guild exists to look at contracts and exists to advise in exactly these matters. So that's a very, very helpful support that the Writers Guild gives. I was asked another question, David, which I thought was really interesting. Is it better to work on a pre-existing project that has some life as in another medium, or something original, do you think? What's your sense of because in a sense that feeds also into the idea of a project being picked up by television, or even potentially picked up by television?
I think that is a really interesting one, and I think it's the idea with a lot of, I think it's true in all mediums, and whether it's stage, TV, audio, video games, anything, that if you start off with the idea of, I want to make a lot of money with something that's definitely going to be commercial and will definitely work, chances are it might go very wrong. And most of the best ideas start off from, oh, isn't this a nice idea? And they go off. When we did Wooden Overcoats, we just said, oh, rival Undertakers, that's funny. And then we started creating characters, and we did all this, and then created this kind of almost sort of Woodhouseian world of strange characters doing this, that, and the other thing, but never with an idea. I mean, certainly we thought, oh, wouldn't this make quite a nice TV show, I guess, but it didn't start off as that. That wasn't the primary idea going forward. And I'm creating new shows at the moment for other companies who've commissioned me to create shows, again, with sort of working with large groups of writers to develop storylines. But it's still very much the idea of it's an audio project, and you start with it as an audio show because it is its own medium with its own rules that can be followed and broken as applicable. I think if you start from it on the point of view of, this is a great story, it's the medium I'm telling it in, let's do the best show we can, you are far more likely to attract not only people who might want to then adapt it into another medium, but perhaps more importantly, an audience. And we create, the podcasts that I've worked on or created directly, we did them because we wanted to reach an audience that we couldn't have reached before. And the big turning point for me was having I had a stage play on in a pub theatre, and it did quite well. I think it was on for 3 or 4 weeks, and I think it sold out most nights. And it was terrific. It was absolutely, the buzz of that was amazing, having the live audience. And then one episode of the podcast that I wrote had, in a single day, in terms of the audience it had in downloads, had more listeners to that one show than every person who'd seen my play in a month in one day. And it was mind-blowing at that point. And I think we've spoken already of the idea of having listeners in different places around the world. You can see where they come from. Most of our listeners are in America, quite a few in the UK. I remember once saying, oh, we appear to have 2 listeners in Vatican City. Brilliant. I'd love to think it's the Pope. I don't know if it is, but it was mind-blowing, the idea, and the global audience, the idea that you can reach people around the world, not only for just audiences and listeners, but for collaborations and working with writers on the other side of the globe on a show which then everyone can hear. And most of podcasts, of course, if they're released via something like iTunes or most other platforms, are usually free for people to listen to. And so there's a great deal of access there for listeners to get involved, to create those audiences, to grow them, to interact with them. Yeah.
I think this is a really interesting, I mean, when I first started writing radio drama, the radio play would go out and you never knew who listened to it. There was never any interaction, any forum. And I think one of the great benefits of the world that we live in now is that you know, and I get personal approaches because of my podcasts, and I'm having conversations with people who have been affected by what I put out, and I've been able to help them. And it just feels like there's so much more of a conversation going on between my attempt to create and put stuff out in the world and then its effects. And I found that really, really empowering, not just for me, but obviously for the people who've approached me.
I'd agree on one that, though the series so Wood and Overcoats is a comedy, it is about undertakers and it is about death, and so it has lots of serious themes. And every so often, I do get emails, or the team get emails from listeners who said they've been through a very tough time lately, and the show helped them to get through it, and they'll discuss, and sometimes we'll have a conversation by email, or people come up to us after a live show back when we could still do them. And you'd have these conversations of people who were touched by it. And I'd say I had, when you see online, the way that audiences respond to a show and they really take it to heart. Yeah. I certainly never received sort of like drawings of characters or fan fiction or lots of this sorts of things that happen online. I never got that for any of my stage plays. Yeah. I suddenly got it for the audio shows I was creating, because the audience is global, interconnected, all talking to each other. Yes. and sharing the enthusiasm.
Yes. Moving forward, Shannon, you started, let's talk about how this Wild West is going to start regulating itself or settle down. You talked about this notion of exclusive rights or exclusivity. Moving forward over the next 2 or 3 years, which is obviously of great interest to all of us here as writers, what do you see the developments being?
It's hard to say. I think right now there's still a lot of resistance to going too much in that direction. I think there's so many people out there doing so many things and so much sort of an independent spirit that I think whenever there's sometimes, even when shows go and get those like big deals, those exclusive, people are like, wow, this has potential for podcasting, but then they also kind of go, oh man, that person, only being on that platform, I don't really love that. So I'm not sure in the long run. There's so many different models going, and I'm just not sure what I do think. What Spotify, for example, is doing is has been really. It's been a fast change in the industry over time. So I do, imagine that some of that is going to be successful. But I foresee that for a while there's going to be a lot of different ways things are going to go. I don't see. Apple's been the behemoth, all along, and they haven't really ever. We'll see what happens with subscriptions. They've never gotten into really producing content or doing a lot of exclusivity. And it's been this kind of very democratized situation. So I think it'd be hard to change that on a dime. But it's hard for me to look into the crystal ball.
Yeah. Let's talk about creativity. Let's come back to Afsaneh and talk about you've had this one experience of being introduced to this world. What advice can you give anybody who might want to create their own podcast, their own non-broadcast drama?
I listen to a lot of it. That's always a great start. So I've been listening to a lot of stuff, both on the BBC, on Audible, on other platforms.
Do you notice a difference between the stuff that the BBC puts out and Audible puts out? Is there a qualitative difference in terms of storytelling?
I would say that the one thing I really notice is that the Audible stuff, they do have the freedom to be a bit more out there, and I think that's the sort of one difference really. But I think the BBC puts out a huge variety of content, and there is sort of something for everyone, I think, and there's a lot of stuff that I personally don't like and lots of stuff that I love. So I think you have to listen broadly and kind of figure out what exactly it is that you're interested in.
Yeah.
And then why does audio benefit that particular story as well? And as I said, I think for me it was like, well, actually it's quite visual, my story, and it goes a lot of places, and so that's actually going to work really well for audio. But I think it's worth sort of thinking about that too. And there are also courses out there. I did one sort of over lockdown online. I know Arvon runs one. That could be really useful as well.
Good. What about you, Martin? Are you going to leap on board this exciting new area and produce some dramas which are not broadcast?
Yeah, probably. I mean, at the moment, I'm, obviously most of my connections are kind of in-house at the BBC. I wanted to refer back. Somebody, I think it was, I don't know whether I'm supposed to say the name of someone I've seen their question, but somebody asked a question about what we when we were talking about tightly structured.
Yeah.
What we meant about that, and I do think that this is an important thing about how this is changing it artistically and creatively, because I've been writing stuff for the BBC over 3 decades, and it was always really pretty kind of hands off, and a lot of the and it was one reason why some of the drama, to be honest, didn't always have a great reputation, because it kind of could be quite discursive and wander around a bit. And there has been this very slow kind of super tanker move to actually having the drama on radio be much more genre based. And what by that I mean being, detective stuff, sci-fi stuff, fantasy stuff, so on, and following the rules, the tighter rules of narrative that you find in television. I write a lot of TV as well. So for years, no one would ever talk to you about story structure and some of the rules of narrative structure that you would encounter all the time in television. When you worked in radio, it was at the BBC, it was just kind of get on with it, really. And there'd be a bit of discussion about what it meant and that sort of thing. And now there is that move to with this Limelight thing of saying it's going to be a 30, or there always used to be 30-minute drama slots. They disappeared about 15, 20 years ago, and they're coming back. And the idea is to say that for the podcast universe, the narratives have to be more tightly structured. There has to be much more faster development of story as you move along. And the dramas will be branded much more as genre. What I mean by that is whereas that afternoon play slot, a lot of the slots were just like dramas. You didn't really ever know what they would be. And some people love that because that's just this kind of chocolate box full of delights or not delights, depending on how you felt about it. There is a need now, because companies like Big Finish, do all that Doctor Who and do all that sci-fi, and that has a market which can be monetized. It has a very, very distinct market. And when you're in a marketplace, which the BBC never used to be, when you're in a marketplace, you have to say, this is my product, this is what you're going to get to attract that audience. And that is going to change the way a lot of people, and it has already changed the way a lot of people approach audio drama in comparison to how it has been for decades, just with companies like the BBC.
Good, thank you. Afsaneh mentioned the writer's room. I wondered if David knew of any practical guide or any way you could go to which would help in creating a podcast or yeah. Do you know of anything that you would recommend?
In terms of some courses of how to create
courses a podcast? or online resources?
Not too many off the top of my head. I know they do exist. I know there are independent companies who create them. I believe the podcasting team behind popular podcasts, Wolf 359 and 0 Hours and other shows, very, very popular American genre shows in science fiction and fantasy. But I know they created an online course of how to create, I'm not sure if it was writing and creating of podcasts. So they are there. So if you search, I can't remember the name of the course off the top of my head, but if on Twitter or Google you looked for Wolf 359 podcast, I'm sure you'd be able to eventually get to it. Otherwise, for us at least, a great deal of creating the podcast happened through just trial and error, much like anything else. We didn't, I would say there are a lot of things I did in that show, which if I had thought about them more, I'd have scared myself out of doing them. For instance, the fact that Wood Nova Goats has quite a large cast. I mean, it isn't like a few people, it's quite a lot of people, because we just decided, let's do it and see what happens. And we did. Now we might be a bit more conservative in the approach of scale, but then perhaps not. What I found really exciting about writing for audio compared to stage was that I could do these things. I could have lots of locations, lots of characters, people running off a cliffside, something collapsing, and not really affect the budget too much. What I would say is, for any advice for any of the writers who are watching, is what I often get from the screenwriters I work with as a consultant is a sense of limitation, that they think that, oh, they're not going to do a lot of the things that they can normally do in a visual form. Now it's an audio, and they come at it as a sort of, how do I scale down? I think, no, it's the opposite. You scale up, you do whatever you like. An idea is a great idea. It doesn't matter what medium it's on. And the difference between radio and podcast, so long as it's a great idea, you're really passionate about it, and you've got an interesting way of telling the story, just go ahead and do it, really, because there is a tremendous growing audience for whatever it is you're doing. There is an audience out there, a big global audience, which makes it more exciting now than ever.
I love the idea of scaling up your imagination, folks. That sounds brilliant. Really, it's a wonderful way to think about this at the end of this hour, which is optimistic and looks forward to the future. The last question I had down here is, what is the Writers Guild doing to organise writers working for more traditional platforms? It's a very good question. I'm hoping that these sessions are part of that process of exploring this new world and of trying to explain to it, and maybe trying to give you some indicators about how to navigate it. If you have any other particular suggestions that you want to make, please do get in touch with me or with Martin, because we're both on the audio committee. And if you want to come and join us on the audio committee, we're always looking for fresh blood. I'm going to hand you over to Kate in a moment, but before I do that, I would like to thank my fantastic panel members. I'd like to thank Afsaneh, David, Shannon and Martin for their contributions. And thank you all for tuning in and listening and asking such great questions.